Very briefly, we will be starting the panel discussion. It will be moderated by Mari Ostendorf, who is a faculty at University of Washington, and who you all know from her excellent talk on prosody earlier during the multimodal NLP track. And with that, I will thank you everyone for all the questions, by the way, that you contributed. It's really helpful. And please welcome the panel.
Okay, thank you all for being here. I'm really happy to have the opportunity to moderate this panel. I'm really interested in hearing from our distinguished group, who I know have all thought about these problems for a long time. So the panel is fairly broad. They're looking at applications for social good, bias and ethics. So I thought what I'd do to start out is have each panelist introduce themselves and tell them within this broad scope what is their particular passion and interest and why. So without further ado.
Thank you, Mari, and thank you everyone for being here. My name is Emily Bender, and I am a professor in the Department of Linguistics at the University of Washington, where I run our professional masters in computational linguistics. And I got involved with the topic of ethics in NLP when a member of our advisory board said in roughly late 2015, early 2016, that we ought to be incorporating it into the curriculum. I thought, that's a really good point. And I looked around for someone to come teach us, and nobody wanted to come do that work for us. And so I thought, I guess this is on me. And I taught my first seminar in winter quarter 2017 on ethics and NLP. And since then, I've been really interested both in how to incorporate these issues and questions and responsibilities into education in our field, and also into the daily practice of people working in the field. So I'm interested in both understanding what the risks are of the technology that we're building, understanding how to make those risks visible to people who are working on the technology, and understanding what are the steps that we can take to start mitigating the risks, always understanding that it's about better, not best.
Hi, I'm Pascale Fung. So I'm a professor of computer science engineering and electronic and computer engineering at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. I'm also director of our Center for AI Research, which aims at promoting interdisciplinary research on human-centered AI to benefit humanity and society. So my interest in ethics in AI started when I became an expert for the World Economic Forum. We had a subgroup discussing ethical AI issues. That was back in 2016. And then I got involved with the Partnership on AI, which is an organization founded by many of the AI companies here in the United States, and now it's a global organization. And Partnership on AI also, its mission and objective is to promote beneficial AI. In particular, we work on the governance and standards and good practice guidelines for different issues in AI. So then, as my role as the director of Center for AI Research, I work with some of our social scientists in this area as well. And recently, we start to think about, with some of our colleagues in the field of computational linguistics, NLP and speech, we start to think about the ethical issues in our field pertain to the applications of language and speech technologies.
Hi, everyone. I'm an assistant professor at George Washington University at the Department of Computer Science, and I'm not a director for anything, but I'm quite passionate about bias and fairness in AI. And my passion stems from the multiple languages I speak, I guess. And one of my native languages is Turkish, and every now and then I used to use Google Translate. And I consistently saw, for example, "obir doktor," which means he or she is a doctor, being translated as he's a doctor, whereas he or she is a nurse being translated as she's a nurse. And in the meantime, I decided that I'm going to investigate word embedding so that I can detect and quantify societal biases embedded in unsupervised semantic spaces. And basically, my research is on quantifying and detecting societal biases in machine learning models, especially semantic spaces and visual semantics. And I try to build fairness-enhancing technologies to mitigate these biases. And in the past, I used to focus on privacy-enhancing technologies at the individual level in machine learning. And I think that also plays a huge role in AI ethics. And I'm passionate about these topics.
I'm Chris Quirk. I'm a researcher at Microsoft. I've been there for about 19 years now. And in that career, I've had an opportunity to work in a number of projects that relate to social good. Together with a range of people in the machine translation team, we've tried to produce machine translation systems that help in disaster response settings to enable communication in some of the toughest situations. So we put together a Haitian Creole system in response to the 2010 earthquake. And I think Rob Monroe in the audience followed on with some great research about how NLP can be a bridge in some of these disaster recovery situations. I've had the opportunity to work on biomedical research, especially with my collaborator Fung and Christina Tutanova and a range of people, about how we can distill information from biomedical literature and try to funnel that towards better patient outcomes. Recently, I've done a little bit of collaboration with Ranjani Ramamurthy. She drives this fantastic project called Empower MD, which is about trying to save doctors time writing up clinical notes by instrumenting the patient room. So she's hiring also. More recently, I've been working on projects related to writing assistance and reading assistance. So tools that enable people to read more quickly, especially those with dyslexia. And I think longer term, we're starting to invest as a company and as an industry in tools to help people write better and more effectively. So dyslexia is often affiliated with dysgraphia, the inability to write effectively, and that can cause really deleterious effects to the perceptions of someone's communication ability if they simply cannot spell well. However, this makes me scared because if we have computers suggesting things that we should be writing in context, changing the content of the things that we've already written, there's an opportunity to introduce both subtle and obvious biases. And so to be able to understand and capture those and work with our customers to better achieve those reading and writing goals, but without amplifying biases that are already present in our data, I think that's a huge challenge for us as a field.
Okay, great. So the plan here is I've got a list of questions that you guys have been posted. It will supposedly be updated if you choose to post more, and I'll just go through some of the top-rated questions and also some questions that the panelists were particularly interested in. So I will start with the question about earlier today we heard talks about all these languages in the world and some that are low resource. So there's so language technology right now really is only serving less than 100 seriously, yet there's maybe 7,000. Is it even realistic to serve them all? What can we do? What if somebody doesn't want to have technology in there? You know, is it possible? How do you deal with all of these languages? So does anybody want to comment on that from a social good or ethical or bias perspective?
Can I jump in on this one? I have strong opinions. So I think that the last little bit about what if someone doesn't want technology for their language? I think if we're talking about really small languages, especially among people who have been subject to colonization, it really needs to be led by the community. And sort of coming in and say, we're going to make this technology for you whether you like it or not is not the right way to go. There's also a lot of room, an awful lot of languages that are big languages that are not particularly only used in in-group situations or not haven't been suppressed through forced residential education, for example, like some of these languages that are underserved. So for those languages, I think there's a lot of scope for NLP technology to be built and to be helpful. And I think the most important way to get there, the most important thing we can all do is to stop assuming that English is the default. And so when we're working on English, to say that we're working on English, because if we don't, we end up in the situation where work on English is NLP and work on anything else is language specific and therefore less interesting.
Can I actually have opinion about current events occurring in Hong Kong. I'm from Hong Kong, so a lot of people are asking what's going on. And for a long time, I've been saying that foreign journalists, including even Chinese journalists, need to understand Cantonese to understand really what's going on in Hong Kong, because 96% of the population in Hong Kong is still Cantonese, and a lot of the messages being sent out, a lot of things being said on, in real time is in Cantonese. And guess what? Most of the journalists outside or in China even don't understand Cantonese. And Cantonese by itself is actually not even a small language. There's 16 million speakers around the world, but it is not a written language. So right now, what we see written in Cantonese is really a colloquial form of transcription, since there has not been any past data in Cantonese. So Cantonese is a very low resource language. And it's leading to a lot of misinformation today. And it's contributing to confusion in the best case and chaos in the worst case. So this is a very clear case where we have not done a good job as a community in terms of even machine translation for language like Cantonese, which is not really that low resource. So imagine what we could do better if we really want to use AI as a force for good, which we can start very close to what we're doing today.
Other comments? You don't have to.
I look at this from the perspective of being able to analyze different languages. If we can scale up to the ability to analyze thousands of languages as opposed to the 100 that we are limited to, we might be able to discover new facts about the world or human nature or language, and I think that might have potentially positive outcomes, because since we have seen that in language, we embed societal biases. We also embed statistical facts or facts about that society. So I think this understanding and potential discovery of new facts about societies that we are not very familiar with can also be used for AI for social good. But this is just a hypothesis, and I think communicating with smaller populations who are not incorporating language technologies is the first step to understand their needs and respect it. And after that, we can probably analyze it together.
So I'm going to actually take off from that one. Since you mentioned, you brought up this issue of culture, and that was one of the questions that I thought, one of the issues that is really the question of bias and ethics, that's going to vary, not just bias, but ethics will vary as a function of culture. And I was wondering if people want to comment how that should factor into the discussions on these topics.
I'll jump in. So I've learned a lot recently from my colleague Batya Friedman about a framework called value-sensitive design. And the idea in that framework is to look at who's going to be impacted by the technology, what their values are, and how the design of the technology can support those values. And I think that that's a framework that's general enough that it should work across cultures, because there's, it's about, well, what are the values of the people being affected? And so when we design something, we think about who's using this, who's going to be impacted by its use, and then go out and try to understand the values of those communities and design for them. And in order to really do that effectively, we need to make sure that there are representatives of the communities in the room doing the design as well. So broadening the participation in our field and then making sure we're understanding who we're impacting and communicating with them, I think, is the way to do that. So it's at a meta level, maybe one size fits all, but only because that one size is, well, find out what people need.
I think that focus on participatory nature is so crucial, right? And this, it cross-cuts language as well, right? Like I mean, it's too easy to think of English as a single language, but as we start dealing with the vernacular that different subsections of society use, we should do a better job of trying to capture that language and understand it and represent the terms that people would like to use, as well as terms that are sensitive for particular populations as well. So finding ways to capture that feedback from the range of subcultures and languages and from the broad variety of linguistic use and practice, finding ways to capture that effectively such that we can all benefit from it is crucial, right? Yeah.
And I also think that being able to use language data from different cultures, we can basically build methods to analyze those cultures and understand their values better as well. And I think now we have the computational power, data sources, and tools to come up with these methods. And this can bring a better understanding about how cultures communicate across years or locations and so on.
So I want to caution against, us thinking that we just have to learn the culture and then align our system's value to that value. As we know, there's inherent human bias in all cultures, right? We're talking about debiasing. Where does the bias come from? It comes from human values. So we cannot, on one hand, say we need to debias because there's human bias. And then on the other hand, when we go to another culture and say, let's just adopt those values, even when they're biased. So I think we need to be consistent, right? Consistent in terms of if we are talking about debiasing, we need to do that for all cultures, right? And we need to promote that idea. We need to promote that universal value to all cultures. On the other hand, I think it is also there's a risk of, how do I put this, cultural insensitivity, obviously. So we need to strike a balance between where we think, where we understand it's, I think this is not just about AI, it's about human society as well. How do we communicate with each other? How do we strike a balance between, striving for a universal value that benefits everybody, including the minority groups in every culture? And how do we still be mindful of the cultural sensitivity? It is something that's very difficult to do even in our societies today. So I don't think that's so easy to do in AI, but we should be mindful of these two sides of the debate.
So I agree with most of what Pascale said, and bias is a critical issue. It's subjective, depends on culture, and depends on the era we live in. And if we try to devise systems, it can be quite problematic because bias also embeds facts about us, our language, the way we live, the way the world, our society is operating. And right now we have at least 21 notions of fairness that we can quantitatively represent, and we are just counting up. And according to the impossibility theorem, we cannot satisfy all of the fairness notions at the same time. And each culture or social group might have different needs or expectations of fairness. And accordingly, we cannot easily find a consensus understanding of what debiasing or fairness should constitute. So this issue seems to require a lot of communication across cultures, individuals, and researchers and industry partners as well.
I was actually trying to say something else. I was trying to say that we should not be apologists just because it's a different culture. I am a product of multiple cultures, and I have seen, what people consider. But I would say, it is important to be fair in all cultures, and we should not be overly apologists for uttering and striving for that goal.
Okay. So another question from the polls. What are some success stories from other fields in mitigating advances in AI used for malicious purposes?
I struggled with this one, honestly, right? I feel like effective AI feels like it's in its infancy these days, and I've seen more failures than I have successes, but I would love to hear from other panelists or from the audience, like where I'm wrong. I would love to see these positive examples.
Can you say that question again?
Okay, so we're interested in success stories from other fields in mitigating advances in AI that are used for malicious purposes. So mitigating malicious AI.
It's a very, very controversial and loaded question because I don't think we have a clear definition of what is malicious AI, because AI is very general, and what's malicious. For example, hacking and security hacking, of course, everybody agrees it's malicious. So that falls in under the realm of cybersecurity even. So there's a lot of people in the cybersecurity field that can work and are working on this kind of, for example, people remotely hacking into smart speaker to turn it into a listening device. I think some company here have people working on that. But I think in other cases, it's not so clear. For example, again, I was at the UN panel on the autonomous weapons. And I think before I went in, I thought everybody agrees we should ban lethal autonomous weapons, ban it. And I learned quickly there are two things that I didn't understand. First, that a total ban requires the consensus of all nation states, right? So if there's one country that doesn't agree, you cannot ban it. So there's no use talking about banning. And also I was surprised to learn who the countries were who did not agree to a ban. That includes the United States, France, UK, and not China. Okay. So, there was no ban. There was not going to be a ban. And so there was a discussion with all nation states on how to therefore regulate such weapon, right? So if you don't really understand the issue, and in fact, the UN has very, very good prior existing regulations against all weapons. So the Geneva Conventions are well developed to regulate new weapons in general since many decades ago. So they're using that to also regulate lethal autonomous weapons. But before that, we have seen a lot of message in the society from AI and non-AI people talking about how we should ban it completely and then we should not work on the technology. The technology is basically consists of everything we do here, language, vision, and navigation, and all that, right? So I would say that it is important to really understand the issue, especially we're scientists or engineers. So we need to participate in this kind of discussion in the society more. And we need to participate in these regulatory efforts. And we need experts. And I would say the biggest danger of malicious AI is actually not AI technology itself, but ignorance. So ignorance leading to the misuse, and ignorance leading to and not understanding how we can regulate it, and so on.
I'd love to pick up on that. I think that the place to look for success stories is actually beyond AI to other cases where we have, as a society and societies, managed emerging technology. And so this is things like, sort of close to home. In the US, if you make a phone call that might be being recorded, you are alerted to that fact, right? If you make a phone call where your voice might be being analyzed by an AI system, we are not yet alerted to that fact. So there's regulation that makes transparent to people who encounter the technology what's going on. I think it's probably where we want to get to. Another example is within the US, again, the FDA requires that all medicines tell you what the active ingredient and inactive ingredients are, so that consumers aren't just taking medicine based on what it's promising it's doing, but they have a bit more information. And I think the way we get there is exactly what Pascale was saying, is that we have the people who understand the technology in the room, in the conversation around regulation, so that we can get to regulations that support innovation and also support beneficial deployment of the technology.
And one brief addition, I think that those are very strong points. I also do like the recent work on data sheets for data sets, so that at least we as practitioners of the field have better awareness of what are the potential biases, what are the sources of data that we're beginning to use. I think there's probably not enough awareness in some of those biases that are already built into data. And so increasing our own awareness is one starting point.
I have a small comment from the privacy and security community since I'm coming from there. There have been a lot of privacy issues or surveillance issues over the internet, and the community has been basically prioritizing transparency and explainability methods over these practices and coming up with potential solutions such as privacy-enhancing technologies, which are also ethical issues, and people at least have some choices for their communications privacy. And in the fairness community, I think if we keep working towards providing potential solutions, people would basically use tools according to their needs, and this will be a starting point at least. And regarding examples from other fields about dealing with AI issues, the first example I remember is Microsoft's tweetbot, Tay, and the solution was basically taking it down in like 8 hours because they couldn't deal with it. And it seems like that's the current state of the art in dealing with these types of ethical problems.
Sadly, I have to agree, right? But I think it is beyond us too. I see cities are legislating shutting down all facial recognition software, right? And I don't know, maybe that's the right answer for a while until we understand the technology better, though it is somewhat disappointing, but yeah.
But I think we should have some kind of testing, bias testing, and it could have been easily tested, like when you release something into the wild, then there are certain things that are low-hanging fruit. The community can work together to formulate these kind of tests. There was like a Sensivel share task where the organizers actually did this gender bias test on all the submitter systems with a very simple methodology. And so I will promote for the field of NLP, at least within the ACL community, for us to have at least a working group to work on this kind of good practice guidelines, just like reviewing guidelines. We should have some kind of voluntary self-test guidelines, and not just for our models, but also I think it's also very easy to test our database, the database that we release to the community before we do so, to test for some kind of very simple kind of bias test, at least to do something, start from there.
Go ahead.
As a first step, while releasing data or models, we should certainly try to include information about the population it represents, the potential biases and problems that come with it. So we need interpretability and explainability methods, but we are dealing with systems that dynamically adapt to whatever data they are observing in the wild. Again, the case with Microsoft's tweetbot. And in that case, the model was basically poisoned by a certain community over the internet, and accordingly, adversarial machine learning and privacy-enhancing machine learning for membership inference attacks and so on seem to be quite important as well.
So I'm going to pick up on the poisoned by various communities in the internet and raise the question. So various companies and academic researchers are looking at how do we detect offensive content or malicious, poisonous content. And so the question was raised, how do we annotate? What are the issues with annotating it? And there's problems, bias will seep in there depending on who you are. You may not think something's offensive. There's also the challenges of the unpleasant nature, subjecting annotators to this content. And so I just thought I'd throw that out for you guys to talk about.
Yeah. So I don't feel like we have solved this problem at all. I think this is a serious, critical challenge of how do we identify some of these biases. I think there are obvious ones that we should try to capture and mitigate or minimize as much as we possibly can. But I think in terms of gathering a panel of annotators that can adequately assess some of these issues, it's very non-trivial, right? Like oftentimes we encounter intersectional issues that if our panel of annotators, we might try to ensure that they cover some notion of the diversity of the underlying audience that we wish to serve. But intersectional issues can be a real challenge, right? Just because we have somebody who represents each distinct aspect in isolation doesn't necessarily mean we capture all the issues that might arise from the intersection of those distinct aspects. So I think there's efforts towards trying to better understand who is doing our annotation and improve the representation of those annotators. I know there's some around our company, but I think we need more here, basically.
I think there's a really interesting tension in there between the people who are best positioned to understand when something is problematic are also the ones who are most vulnerable to having to deal with it, and like it's the hardest to ask them to do this work. And I wonder if there's scope for trying to leverage naturally occurring annotations a little bit. So I'm thinking about heavily moderated and curated forums online where there's people who have volunteered as moderators to try to keep the space a welcoming one for people with various marginalized identities that the space is for. That might be a starting point for gathering relevant sort of noisy data. leveraging work that is hard work that somebody has already done, and then ideally that is done, in collaboration with those moderators, asking permission. Is it okay for us to use this as, everything above board? But I think that might be one way in for at least some of it.
It seems like we really need methods and ways of increasing participation for underrepresented groups. And this can maybe happen through official channels as well, for example, industry partnership or NSF funding for data collection, because that's going to benefit those populations. And in the meantime, probably collaborating with other disciplines such as social psychologists, social scientists, urban planners, policymakers on these issues would probably help computer scientists and linguists understand these issues from the other side that has been dealing with similar problems in society for decades.
Okay, another question. What are the moral, ethical obligations of NLP researchers beyond biases?
What are the moral, ethical application, of any person, any human being, to stick by the golden rule, to not do harm, right? So I think if we are mindful of not doing harm, that's already very important, very, very big challenge. So how can we be sure that what we are doing is not doing any harm? So
I think we can never be sure that it's not doing harm, but I think that we, as people working with computers, have an extra challenge to understanding the potential for harm, because it's very easy to feel like, well, it's just me in this machine, right? Or it's just me in that data set, and many of us don't often actually even look at the contents of the data set, but you all should, right? Look at your dev data. But it's often, I think historically in computer science, it's just sort of abstract. We're working with abstractions. It doesn't exist in the world. Those aren't real people. And so I think we do have an obligation to think through how what we're doing actually connects to real people, and to think about, in research papers, we'll often have these sort of motivating examples that are completely artificial. Speaking from an academic point of view, I think many times the research papers coming from industry are more embedded in actual applications, and so maybe that is a better position to understand the people. But to actually think through both, what's great about this and what could go wrong. Again, coming back to value-sensitive design, there's a technique called design noir, where you say, let's imagine that this technology that I built succeeds and everybody's using it. What are the impacts at a society level if everyone's using it? What are the impacts on somebody who's young? What are the impacts on somebody who's not a fluent speaker of the majority language here, and so on? And sort of think through those things and make that part of our regular practice will help us be in a better position to not do harm, although you can never avoid all of it, so it's always better, not best.
I think computer scientists and linguists probably need to understand that the tools that they are building are reaching communities broader than just their own limited fields. And accordingly, they need to acknowledge the limitations and potential risks of the technologies that they are building, and maybe coming up with standards and some evaluation techniques of the implications on ethics of the technologies that they are building. For example, third-party inspections and so on, such as we do for drug studies before releasing drugs, might be helpful, at least to understand what kind of risks we might be dealing with.
I think a good exercise would be to have a section on ethics in papers when we write up our research. Spend a paragraph or two just thinking about it, and if that becomes part of the regular conversation, we will be better positioned to, meet our moral obligations.
So I'm just going to put an extra little twist on that question. So you've provided some answers, and I'm starting to think, okay, I know you teach ethics, and probably you guys are teaching this stuff. So for a course in somebody who's in AI, a student in AI or NLP, what should an ethics course that they take cover?
You want to take it?
When I was an undergraduate EE student, we all had to take a course called the ethics, right? But it didn't really directly pertain to what we do. So to me, it was to many of us, it was a separate course. So what I do today in all the AI classes I teach, I have at least one session or one chapter or one lecture dedicated to the ethics question. So it's in the classes I teach, but I don't teach a particular ethics in AI class. Not an entire, because what's the point of teaching a separate class on ethics if students are not taking it, right? Unless you mandate students to take it, which is very difficult. So I think there should be an angle or perspective on ethics, ethical issues, at least classroom discussions in every AI class we teach.
I teach the bias in AI class, and I start with comparing human decision-making to machine decision-making, and after that, look into interpretability and explainability, and then look into fairness, bias sources and pathways, and mitigation strategies, and compare this to privacy and inference attacks, and that basically covers my entire course.
So I'm teaching a seminar again this fall on ethics and NLP, and I agree with Pascale that this doesn't, I think it's worthwhile to have a separate course, but it can't be just a separate course. There has to be something in the regular courses because it shouldn't be seen as separate, but it's still, I think, worthwhile to have a chance for people who want to dig in deeper to dig in deeper. So from the perspective of that dig in deeper class, I think it's about learning, okay, what are the kinds of negative impacts that the technology we're building can have? What are our responsibilities? How does it fit into the day-to-day work of an NLP technologist? And then what are the range of possible mitigating approaches there are? So, debiasing and the techniques of this design noir thing I was talking about before, and basically giving the students that toolkit, and then giving them a set of questions that they can work into their classes if the other classes aren't doing it, right? The sort of, the what could go wrong at every step, and how to think through that, and how to think what to do about it.
I like liberal arts degrees with history in them, right? Like, I think going back to this integrated view of how information is carried, like understanding how things have gone wrong in the past with technology or just people in general, that feels invaluable, right? So making sure that our education system stays balanced overall, but I don't really teach, so I'll defer to you folks.
Well, but you hire people.
Oh, that's true. That's true.
So, okay, so sticking on this ethics theme, when a lot of us work on applications that end up touching on other fields, whether it's social science or medical, we've heard about mental health. So how do we, and many of these fields have their own codes of ethics. How do we, is there a responsibility to learn their code? Is there, how does this factor into the discussion?
I think a lot of fields, like what I'm more familiar with is working with, financial industry and the medical industry. They are heavily regulated industries, and they have obviously code of conduct and so on, where the doctors have the Hippocrates oath and so on. But I don't think it's practical for engineers to learn all the codes of conduct and comply to every single industry, because we might not be, I don't think it's how do I say, practical for us to learn to, because we're not really professional in those fields. We're not supposed to be certified medical professionals or bankers or any of those. We're not. And we do have our own, I'm talking about the engineering field, we have our own codes of conduct. ACM has a set, ACL has a set of codes of conduct, and IEEE certainly has. So if we can actually comply to our own codes of conduct, that's already very good. So pertaining to these other fields, I think we need to, actually it's not even coming from us. When we collaborate with people in that field, they're going to require that whatever we do is compliant to their governance. For example, a lot of financial applications using our technology needs to comply with those regulations. So they might not be able to use something that we do, in particular data privacy and so on. Same thing in medical domain. We have a lot of challenge to meet before we can actually apply our technology in those domains. And this is what I see in practice, that there are a lot of things we cannot do, actually, even though the technology is there, but they cannot apply. So if we really want to help them, we need to come up with different ways, different algorithms, and to help them. So this is a challenge we see today. For example, in precision medicine, a lot of existing machine learning methods are not effective because they have their own kind of challenge, own set of challenge on data. So then we need to be innovative in coming up with different machine learning methodologies to help.
I think one other issue is, other than compliance, we don't have any regulations or policies. So we basically have these systems that are amplifying bias, perpetuating bias. They are polarizing society, spreading disinformation campaigns. Driverless cars are not able to detect certain populations, and there is no policy that can deal with this at the moment, and there is no accountability as well. And I think those should also be involved in discussions about ethical conduct and basically ethical principles.
So I'm going to pick a question that's totally different from what we've talked about so far. Climate change is an existential threat. On a very high level, where do you see the biggest opportunity for the ML AI community to create an impact in mitigating and adapting to climate change?
Stop having conferences where people have to fly. I should stop going to conferences. No, I mean, that's just only half a joke, but we do contribute to a lot of that. And I know some researchers have recently pledged not to travel by air. But there's
a related question here about compute power, too.
Yeah, exactly, computing power.
I was going to say there was a wonderful paper at ACL by Emma Struble, I think is her name, and co-authors, actually calculating the carbon impact of training some of these large-scale models, including all of the grid search for parameters. And I think that being mindful of that and not just saying, oh, I'm just going to hit run on my experiment, it's a separate thing, it only exists in logical space, is probably a worthwhile thing for us to do. Easy for me to say as someone who works on rule-based systems, I know, but...
I'm not sure how much these can contribute, but we know that blockchain technologies are probably contributing to climate change. But at the same time, the AI community is building projects on smart communities and smart urban planning, so they should probably incorporate methods to potentially deal with climate change and at least try to have more efficient communities and cities. That might be some kind of a contribution by the AI community.
If we can share the things that we build better, then that's one way to try to mitigate some of these costs involved in training the big ones. I think the community's been doing a lot better about that, but we could push it further. And then if we can make communication better so we don't need to travel as much, I don't know. Like that seems like a high charter, but a possibility.
So a lot of the work in the NLP community today is around gender bias, a lot of the bias work. What other, we've mentioned a few biases in this discussion, but are there anything that you have ideas about in terms of how to identify them in the data?
So I built methods to detect and quantify bias and potentially uncover biases that have not been documented in society yet. And the main ones I start with are usually the universally accepted stereotypes, such as the attitude towards butterflies and flowers versus insects, or the attitude towards weapons versus musical instruments. But then we can identify bias, for example, racial bias, African Americans versus European Americans, or the stigma towards people with certain disease, or how women are associated with art and literature, whereas men are associated with career and science and math. And you can basically think about all the biases documented in social psychology in the last 2 decades, and we are able to replicate all of those in basically word embeddings right now. And we are building tools to uncover biases that are previously unknown, which will probably reveal new things about human nature that we haven't expected. But we can also use these tools to look back in history and build models on historical documents. And by historical, I mean from the 1800s, 1900s, and different populations, and try to understand their biases as well.
One of the things that's very difficult in terms of work, doing research on sexism detection or gender bias is the detection of benevolent sexism or any benevolent bias, benevolent racism, benevolent sexism. So one of my students has been working on this, and this is the challenge that we encounter. And I heard from other groups that they also encounter this similar kind of challenge. Something that's considered to be a compliment can be inherently very sexist, and in fact, it's detrimental to the young women of that gender. So this is the challenge we're facing, and it's not just a computer science challenge. So there's where you talk about distributional bias, but there's also the benevolent sexism that we need to work on as well.
I want to bring up a couple points there. One is about categories. So when we're talking about racial bias, it's pretty quickly obvious that the racial categories are very culture specific. And I think it's fairly easy to identify that there are, we can't go in with a preset set of categories to try to understand the problem. And I imagine your methods are on that. I think we often in this research around gender make the mistake of assuming that that's a binary. And then we miss out a whole other kind of issue with gender and bias. And that's worth keeping sort of on the surface. And then totally separately, another kind of bias around different groups of people is what Chris was talking about before about different varieties of language, right? So what we learn from sociolinguistics is that different groups will speak differently, and that happens very naturally, and it's really common for technology to be sort of targeted at the prestige, standardized variety, and then not serve the full population. And in many contexts, the prestige standardized variety is actually spoken by a minority. And even if it's spoken by the majority, we still have to worry about the people who don't speak that variety and make sure that we can meet them with their language, with the technology.
So I'm going to ask one more specific question, and then we'll close with a more broad question for all of you. So the more specific question, can or should the personality of conversational agents be designed to nudge the cultural, ethical values of human users? And this is basically, could be interpreted more broadly than that.
I mean, I think if we're not careful, it's far too easy to amplify biases, right? Like, I think at a bare minimum, we need to have a corrective factor to not do this amplification process, it feels like to me. And beyond that, I think it touches on some of the broader governmental and regulatory aspects that Pascale was mentioning before, that like, I think our responsibilities are not totally clear, and it probably shouldn't be for us within this community to define all by itself. It's a conversation that we should open up to the broader population and get feedback. I mean, just the way that these codes of ethics have built around other engineering practices and people with fiduciary responsibilities or medical responsibilities, there needs to be a sort of interaction about what that should be, but yeah, so I guess I'm giving a conflicting answer, right? Like, I'd hate to see our biases amplified further, but it feels like there should be a participatory process by which we define what that means and how we quantify it and capture when people are violating that agreement, right? Mm-hmm.
I agree. I think when you say we should avoid amplifying biases, I think that's another way of saying there is no neutral position here. That either the virtual agent is maintaining the status quo, which is not a neutral position, or it's pushing back against it. And I think that the discussion works better if we start by acknowledging that.
I also have two examples, and I think we should keep working on these as researchers. For example, there are some conversational bots that can help people with anxiety to deal with their issues by basically having random, simple conversations. And if that's useful for their health, why not? And another approach is basically on social media or on the internet, when there are toxic conversations and trolls, there are certain ways to inject positive bias to basically change the direction of that conversation and get rid of the toxicity. And I don't see much harm here by changing the conversation to a positive direction and save it from that toxic environment. And I think these two approaches are probably useful for many people.
Okay, we're reaching the end, and I thought I'd give one sort of open question. So one of the issues that has come up a lot is that, well, people need to understand technology, we need to be more aware, there needs to, people making regulations need to understand the blah, 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 blah. Okay, so my question is, what can we as individuals or the NLP community do to better educate the public or regulators or whatever?
Participation. If you're invited, I know that a lot of these governments invite a lot of us to participate in their discussions, and many of our colleagues turn it down because they don't have time. They're more interested in technical work than that. But I think it is part of our responsibility to educate the public and the government, because we make the stuff, right? And what we do impacts people who use it. So we need to participate in these conversations. And as earlier I mentioned PAI, Partnership on AI, it's a pretty unique organization that's working on governance because it has mostly engineers who are working in the field, participating in these conversations. Many other organizations talking about guidelines and standards and ethical principles consist mostly of people outside of the field. And their understanding is limited. So the engineers, we need to participate and not just educate the public, but the government and other experts, ethics experts and philosophers. We need to do that. So, but the responsibility is huge today. I never imagined we had to do this, but it is a huge responsibility. And I think when we get a chance, we should all do that and not turn it down because it's too important.
So you guys all need to answer this one.
Yeah. I would encourage everyone to think carefully about how users provide feedback and how communities provide moderation every time we put out systems. I think some of our more notable problems right now with large-scale social media and text in the wild is around these problems. That how do people report some of the bias issues that they're getting in a way that we can understand it as developers and try to correct for those? And then as we spread out to these gigantic audiences, how does the community begin to moderate itself and give some feedback? I mean, I realize these are challenging issues, but I think it's crucial as our systems hit gigantic scale to have that kind of feedback loop.
I think that one of our main responsibilities is to come up with a common language to communicate AI and technology issues to other fields, including policymakers and lawyers. And it's our responsibility to explain these black box systems that we are building. And usually the more opaque the systems are, the better performing they are. And we need to basically come up with an explanation to social scientists or policymakers and explain that, yes, this has very high accuracy because it's usually optimizing its algorithm for the majority population that the data is representing. And as a result, it's going to have a disparate impact. And we need to clearly communicate these. And we are responsible of these technologies. So we need to understand what kind of consequences it's going to have on society. So I think this communications and science and technology communication plays an important role.
I had a very similar thought, which is I want to encourage everyone to cut back on the hype and to replace it with really transparent dialogue about the data part of the systems. The algorithms are very cool. They're doing very neat, very sophisticated things, finding the patterns in the data, and then they get presented to people as some kind of expert or some kind of autonomous agent. I think it's actually really unfortunate how much we call AI right now because it's not actually intelligent. Right? And we do an awful lot of anthropomorphization that I think is irresponsible. And so making it transparent to the people who are using it and to the people who are affected by it that this is ultimately, pattern matching, I think, is an important step in the right direction. And there are some ways of doing that as a design element. So I really appreciate in some of the voice assistant systems and also the Microsoft Live Translator system, how it updates its hypotheses about the ASR portion. I think that's a really nice design feature that shows people the system has some uncertainty and it's making some guesses. It's not telling people what it's making those guesses based on, but basically design that brings that to the foreground so people can see it in place of the design that makes things look like these shiny science fiction robots would be a step in the right direction.
Okay, I would like to thank all of our panelists. And also thank the audience for all of the great questions. All right.